no such thing as just a microaggression. If people are operating within that space, that environment potentially can become very toxic.
You are now part of a social experiment.
See now where my limit is. Only got no ohs.
Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us today on the journey towards self mastery. Our next guest is an award winning learning development specialist with over 30 years of experience in the UK. She's author of the book Almost British and has performed several poetry pieces for some of the most notable names in England, like Mayor Sadiq Khan. As a workshop facilitator that has done work on anti racism, she's done work on trauma informed practices, mental health in the workplace. She's held positions as senior development advisor, race and equity policy manager, and has worked on improving prisoner conditions in the UK. She was the first to design a cross jurisdictional training for judges in unconscious bias awareness in the UK. After experiencing racism in her workplace for over 20 years, she sued the Ministry of Justice in the UK and won. She's now working on a doctoral degree focused on weaponized whiteness on Black people during mundane professional interactions, aka workplace racism. Let's welcome today Miss Nairobi Thompson to the program. Miss Thompson, it is a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you so much. It is my absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, man. I'm glad.
All good things come to those who wait.
Yeah. I'm glad. I know you're super busy. You're working on your doctorate right now with workplace racism and everything, and so I appreciate you sparing some time for us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Any opportunity to obviously talk about my research, my experiences, fundamentally, though, as a way of supporting and helping others.
Yeah. I think this is a space where a lot of us, I think globally, like we feel very uncomfortable because the emotions and then also the finance come to play. And it's like when you experience some of these things, you're like, do I say something? I don't want to get fired. I don't want to get in trouble, but you're uncomfortable in these settings, and some of the things you're experiencing is not right. It's not just, but it's difficult, man. So we're gonna definitely be talking about some of those things today. And I know you're in the UK, so I know like we might have some US listeners that are not familiar with how things function in the UK, how people function in the workplace, how Black people function with white people. But in the US here, when it comes to working while Black in the United States, a lot of Black people are dealing with racism at work, pay inequality, lack of training, limited opportunities for advancement, low pay, discrimination, lack of representation, especially looking at leadership positions, having to work twice as hard or three times as hard, experiencing a lot of burnout, cultural insensitivity, and we can go on and on and on and on. Do you find that these are similar things that are happening in the UK? And can you share with us just like the dynamics between Black and white people in the workplace in the UK?
Well, you haven't listed anything that is not being experienced in the UK. So I think
Mm,
that's the first place to start. Everything that you're talking about in terms of underrepresentation in senior roles, lack of promotional routes, differential outcomes in terms of disciplinaries, differential outcomes in terms of how sickness is managed. And sickness often is, you can correlate it to burnout, and you can
hmm
correlate it to the stress associated with the poor treatment that Black people in the UK experience in the workplace. But they are likely to suffer disproportionately negative outcomes in terms of how their sickness absence is managed and the level of empathy and leadership compassion that is extended towards them when they are on sick leave. Yeah.
mm,
So
mm,
the situation is similar. I mean, there are numerous reports being produced by various think tanks and employment unions that quantify the extent of racism in the workplace. So just in 2022, there was a survey that found that more than 120,000 workers quit their jobs because of racism in the
mm,
UK, the racism at work. And there are other reports that say the same thing. You get Black and Asian UK workers, they say that they are held back at work by bias. And again, that is outputs from another survey. And they go on and on. Another one by Pern Candola entitled Racism at Work in the UK report revealed that three-quarters of employees thought that racism was a problem. They found that over half had witnessed racism at work. 1 in 5 reported the incident to management, and a quarter said that they took no action following the event. And of those who didn't take any action, they said it's because they feared the consequences.
Sounds about the same.
It's
Sounds
the
about
same.
yeah,
It's the
absolutely.
same. And I know people like to think that I've spoken to people who think, oh, the US, it's so bad over there. Over there it's really bad, but we're not so bad in the UK. Yes, we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we are. And in terms of my own experience, I feel like it's worse because they're in denial that it exists at all.
Mm-hmm. And there are more white people in the UK, correct?
The black people, absolutely,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. So we are a minoritized community.
If do you know the percentage of black people in the UK? Just
Oh
by
no, I don't know off the top of my head. The last survey was done, and I think it was around 13-14% of the population described themselves as being of a different ethnic origin to white.
got it. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. All right. So we do have some interesting things happening in the US as well, as far as workplace racism and some of the things that exist at work. So the US has this whole thing called the Crown Act that looks at discrimination because of hair and things like that.
Hmm.
Which I think is hard to kind of really track. Like, how do you track somebody's discriminating because of hair? But it's an act. It's called the Crown Act. And then we've talked about this before, that the U.S. does a lot of trainings in the workplace, like implicit bias trainings and things like that, which I want to talk about further as we delve into the interview. But what do you see some of the responses in the UK like to dealing with workplace racism, and are any of them effective? Because I don't see any of these things in the US as being effective in dealing with racism that's occurring in the workplace.
So we don't have anything specific like the Crown Act, but there is a lot of activity around hair discrimination, children being excluded from school because their hair is black children. Their hair, either the school has decided the hair is too big,
Mm-hmm.
it's obstructing other students,
Mm.
or they assume that because we either cut or braid patterns into the hair, that it's a gang sign or some kind of gang affiliation. I mean, it's really quite ridiculous that authorities are prepared to interrupt a child's education uh, to the extent of sending them home or expelling them from school because
Mm-hmm.
of their hair. And we know that this hair discrimination, has a long history in terms of the dehumanization of black people, because it was, one of the first things that they did to the enslaved Africans was to shave their heads,
Mm.
because our hair was distinctive. It was cultural. It spoke of our status. It spoke to our tribal affiliations, where we came from, etc. Our lineage. Our hair and what we did with our hair communicated so much about our respective identities. So one of the first things they did was they got rid of our capacity to be able to look and see that person is Mandinkan, or that person, is Ashanti, or that person, that is Igbo. They dispensed with our ability to be able to identify each other in that way, and it was
Mm-hmm.
part of the dehumanization. So there's been a lot over the centuries. There's been a lot of focus on our hair, and fundamentally, it is about undermining our capacity to have our own identity
Mm.
and pride
Mm.
in that.
Mm. Very, very interesting. Great points. Same here. Same here. Same here
Mm,
in the U.S.
yeah,
um,
this is what I'm
yeah.
saying. This is what I'm saying. People like
Yes.
to compartmentalize and say, "Oh, it's different here and it's different there." But actually, when if you think deeply enough about the core, in that we're talking about colonization and we're talking about European colonization, Europeans, Britain, it's European, and
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
Europeans colonized America, and they drew with them their European principles, their European biases, their European prejudices,
Mm.
which justified, the murdering of indigenous peoples, the trafficking of African peoples and other
Hmm.
peoples. So, we're fundamentally looking at how Europeans operated, how
Hmm.
they embedded themselves in other countries, and how they dispensed with other cultures and cultural knowledge, etc. So why would America be any different when you consider where Americans, as we know them, came from? They're European.
Absolutely. 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 Thank you for that vital information. Um, all right, before we get into your work, your experiences and the work you're doing now, I wanted to get into a little bit of childhood. I know in your book you talk about some of your childhood, and the original workplace for children is the school.
I
So
like that. Yes.
yeah. So can you share like some of your experiences growing up in the UK and school setting and dealing with race? Like when were you first like aware of race, like growing up?
I was aware when I was about 10, I think. In the book, I refer to a little boy down the lane, uh,
Mm,
because we lived in terraced houses. So they're sort of like, I don't know, your equivalent of townhouses, but much smaller, but they're back to back.
mm-hmm,
And down the behind the houses there's an entry passage, so you could
mm-hmm,
come in the back gate, or you could
mm-hmm,
walk around to the front, which is the street where the cars would be driving. So I would have to go to the shop. Just, I mean, the shops were quite close. It wasn't a big sort of deal to pop out to the shop as a child. When I was growing up, it was quite a safe neighborhood.
mm-hmm,
And whether went down the roadside, as in street side, or whether I went down the back entry, this little boy would wait for me. And when he saw me, he would jump out um, a good distance from me and shout, nigger, nigger, blacky packy, nigger, nigger, blacky packy.
mm.
And
What's Blackie Packy?
so
What is that?
blacky obviously is another pejorative, and it's derived from nigger, and
Mm,
Paki
mm-hmm,
is Pakistani, so Indian. But because it was a little rhyme for him, he just
mm.
introduced this whole sort of like rhythm.
They all went together.
So we're all together, so we're
Yeah,
all, uh,
interesting.
and I mean, I didn't understand the language, because it was never used in my home, and where we listen to music, not like today, it wasn't, our music wasn't populated with pejoratives like that. So I didn't really know what the
Mm-hmm,
words meant, but I knew they were bad, and I knew that they were directed at me because of my skin color.
mm.
Yeah, so that was like my first real experience of understanding that people will be abusive towards me simply because of the color of my skin.
Now, at 10 years old, did you internalize that as like there's something wrong with me or there's something wrong with him?
I thought that there was something was wrong with him, which is why I gave him a good beating.
Ah man, right on, right on.
Which is
I'm
terrible, But I was a bit of a scrapper when I was a kid. And if I didn't understand something, if I thought that you were being mean for no good reason, I would hit you, and despite being told, we don't hit other people and da da da, because I struggled to get my words out, then I would lash out instead. So
yes.
it just happened to one occasion when he was shouting at me, and we were in the back entry, so there's nobody else there. And my brother
Hmm.
came out of the back gate of our house.
Mm-hmm.
saw what was going on. And the little boy, he would normally call me names, and as I continued to walk closer to him, and when I got too close, he would run inside his house and shut the door. But this time my brother was there and he made sure he didn't get to run inside, and I lashed out. He never called me names again.
Mm.
Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, but that's how I dealt with it as a 10-year-old. As you get older,
It's a little different. A little different. Yeah.
it's a little different. The
Yeah.
racism at school, again, was not something I recognized until I started to reflect as an
Mm-hmm.
adult on what had happened to me. So the stereotyping that was done, I didn't know I was being stereotyped as slow and lazy. I didn't recognize that as a stereotype for black people and black children.
What was the demographics of your school?
The town where I live was and still is quite diverse.
Mm-hmm.
So when my mother and father came from the West Indies and settled in Britain as citizens, because they were British citizens when they arrived with British passports, etc.
Mm.
A lot of people settled in the major cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc. But also quite a few in the counties, which is where I live in Northamptonshire, because there was a lot of industry, breakfast cereals, boot and shoe, and engineering and steelworks.
Mm-hmm.
So, because of that localized industry, there was an influx of West Indians, then an influx of Africans, then an influx of Asians. So, I would just say the town was and still is quite diverse.
Got it. Got it. Were your teachers diverse too?
No, no, I've never had a black teacher. I've never
Wait.
had a black teacher, and
Wow.
it's only now that I'm doing my doctorate, I'm actually being supported by a pair of wonderful black supervisors. But I've
That is
never had a black teacher, and so
that is
I found actually my report cards from when I was 7, doing a little bit of a tidy. I was like, oh, look at these, and was immediately angered by the way that they had stereotyped me at 6 and 7 years old. And they just
mm,
kept on saying, that I'm lazy. And if I can be bothered, I might be able to achieve something. I'm very slow, etc. And that
mm,
was them classifying me for every subject, slow and lazy, slow and lazy, slow and lazy. When the reality was I was dyslexic and they
mm,
were not very interactive as teachers. So they just taught by telling, and you had to sit still, you had to listen, which is quite excruciating for somebody who has dyslexia and dyspraxia.
mm.
I'm talking now, and I'm constantly using my hands, my eyes flit about to look at something else to keep me focused, etc. And when you're being made to sit still and disciplined for not sitting still, you don't learn.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that's how they wrote me off at 6 and 7, and my junior school, so 7 till 11, was the school next door. So that report followed me. They treated me in exactly the same way, to the extent of taking me out of mainstream education and putting me into remedial learning.
Mm.
No consultation with my parents, nothing.
That is fat. That is no consultation with the parents.
No,
Wow. Wow. That's I'm pretty that was breaking some laws, right? Is that
not then. No,
no?
not then.
Wow.
No. Yeah,
That is
I mean,
fascinating.
they did what they felt was the right thing to do.
Wow.
They
That
didn't
that
have
is
to send a letter, nothing, and nobody pulled them up on anything, because there was this assumption anyway that children from the West Indies were educationally subnormal, and that was
mm,
a widely accepted, despite the fact that there was no proof. You had one head teacher in Haringey, a borough in London, doing a rough calculation about, based on the outputs from IQ tests, and based on his rough calculation, he determined that where there was a predominance of black children in a school, the educational attainment would drop. So, in order to maintain the same levels of educational attainment, black children needed to be taken out of mainstream education and placed into special education needs schools. So
Man,
that was,
the UK is just straight up, man. Like
oh, this is
this
what
is
I'm telling you. This is what I'm telling you. So
wow.
that said, the parents were, and I say consulted in the most loose way, in that they were basically just told your child needs to go to this school. It's special. So again, parents were not properly informed. And a special school, you can think, oh, school for the gifted, because the information wasn't given. And these individuals are now, taking legal action now
Mm,
because their
man.
entire adult life
Hmm.
has been disrupted by this, not only the lack of education that they received, but the stigma that it created,
Hmm.
and the levels of internalization was so profound that they still struggle to see themselves as able to contribute.
Mm. I know you mentioned too in your book, like you say, I was not meant to achieve, and that's why my education was so bad. I went to school where nothing great was expected of me. And you also mentioned that you were focused on the arts, and you made really no focus on education at all. And you didn't learn much in school. You didn't do much in school. Nothing was expected. How did you kind of make it through school and graduate and and all that? Like,
Well,
how,
I was having fun. That was part of the problem. Because nothing was expected, I was not under pressure to learn. And learning was hard for me because, as I said, I was dyslexic and dyspraxic and it hadn't been diagnosed. So to be excused from French or history or geography or math to go and do some acting or dance, I was like, yes, please. Yeah. So I got to 15, and my exam results were so bad. And I was listening to a news program, a local news program, and they were talking about the results for the region. And I realized I was a statistic because they
mm,
specifically talked about Black children under attainment. And I
hmm,
realized I was one of them.
hmm.
And that's when I decided I needed to, buck up my ideas and get myself an education. And I am still on that journey.
That is amazing, man. Black excellence, black excellence. Uh, so a lot of what wasn't done has been, something that you kind of really sought to do for yourself, which I think is excellent. So afterwards on this journey, you're learning, uh, you're becoming a developmental specialist,
Hmm.
working in different workplaces and things like that, and developing diversity, inclusion, all type of things. So what made you interested in that career path?
It started off when I was working in a sales company, and when I joined, I didn't get an induction, and it was the product ranges were quite extensive, and I was learning on the job, and so I had to organize my own learning to do that. And as soon as I organized my learning, I was a very successful salesperson because I could find the products, the product codes, and that sort of thing, and then really work with the customer base to meet my
Hmm.
targets, etc. And then other people joined the company, and I just appreciated that they would be in the same position that I was in. So I started to hand over my notes and coach. Nobody was asking me to do it, but that's my nature. If I see you struggling going down or up an escalator and I'm going the opposite direction, I'll go all the way down and come all the way back up to help you
Hmm.
with your bags.
Hmm.
Um, so that's what got me into that space of helping others to build skill and to build their knowledge. And
Hmm.
it wasn't long before I was then being asked to do that formally.
Hmm.
And then I realized that this is something I was really enjoying, putting materials together, doing the research to back things up, and trying to work out the best way to deliver certain concepts or principles, and putting a learning path together. And so I then decided that I needed to get a qualification in it, in terms of learning and development, and started just doing some basic certification in training and development, etc., etc., until I ended up doing my master's in training and performance management.
Got it, got it. So if we fast forward, this eventually led to a position in the Ministry of Justice
Hmm.
in the UK. And just for some context, I know people may not be familiar with the justice system in the UK, and who are in these prisons and who are these criminals. So, can you just paint a quick picture for us of exactly what those demographics are? And I know you've worked a lot with criminal treatment in the UK and things like
Mm.
that. So can you share with us just what the Ministry of Justice is all about?
Yeah, so it's an executive arm of the government, and it's in place to execute, ministerial directions. So anything coming from the government in terms of how we manage offenders, how we treat them, the Ministry of Justice executes that. So the prison service, the courts, tribunal courts, as well as the judicial courts, and they all come under this umbrella of Ministry of Justice. So you can end up working in lots of different areas and departments and across the country. Some roles have international reach as well, but essentially it's how do we manage justice in our country? You've got those who legislate and make the laws. You've got those who execute, as in Ministry of Justice and the police. Yeah, and we all sort of like work, well, should be working together to make sure that there's an effective justice system in the country and prevention of crime and violent crime.
Mm. And if we look at the prisons in the United States, I think listeners already know who the people in the prisons in the United States are. Who are
Again,
the people in the prisons in the UK?
an overrepresentation of black males.
Mm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's the same. I mean, there are studies that demonstrate that, for example, the judges have sentencing guidelines. So you commit a particular crime, you found uh, guilty of committing a particular crime, you can get between 1 and 10 years, let's say, for that crime. If you are white, you are more likely to get a non-custodial, or you'll get 2 or 3 years, and with time served, etc. And then if you're black, you're more likely to get the 8 to 10 years custodial sentence. So with this disparity in how sentences are discharged, you end up with an overrepresentation of black people in prison. I mean, it's a very simplistic view. I appreciate that, but what I'm fundamentally saying is it's no different to the way it is in the US. There's still this disproportionality in terms of how sentences are handed out, which ultimately leads to an overrepresentation.
Got it. Got it. Sounds about the same, like you just said. So at the Ministry of Justice, you were dealing with a lot of workplace racism, a lot of discrimination,
Hmm.
and this was over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And there was an article about you. It says Miss Ebanks claims she was called racially insulting names by a manager, prevented from progressing her career, and had her out of work activities monitored.
Hmm.
She says she was also accused of bringing the ministry into disrepute for writing a book about her life and experiences of prejudice in the prison
Hmm.
services. So I know this is a 20-year period of time. So
Hmm.
let's run through a highlight real quick of just some of your experiences dealing with racism in the workplace as one of the few Black people in that space.
When I was writing the book, one of the things that dawned on me was that I had never been called aggressive until I started working for the civil service. I mean, I'd lived some 30 odd years with being told that, I speak up for myself, I'm assertive, I'm forthright, I'm passionate, I'm enthusiastic, all of these other words to describe me. But as soon as I started working for the Ministry of Justice, all of that ability was just conflated into one term, aggressive. So I immediately became this angry black woman. And that stereotype has dogged me throughout my entire civil service career. And it was just, as I say, it was just startling when I was writing the book. But I thought to myself, I don't recall ever being called aggressive until I started working here.
Hmm. What about the your manager? I think you mentioned her name was Sue in your book. Um, what were these racially insulting things that she was doing to you?
It was the differential treatment to begin with. That was the first thing. I noticed that I was being treated differently, and I couldn't understand the basis for the differential treatment. And it was simple things like, not wanting to sign off my expenses. That
Mm,
doesn't necessarily equate to racism. I get that, and I wasn't thinking race at the
hmm
time. Um, she had me on induction for nearly 4 months, bearing in mind that I joined the team with a couple of decades of experience as
mm,
so I was a seasoned learning and development person. I had already as well spent 2 years as head of education in a prison. So I was managing offender education. So that meant that in terms of understanding how a prison works, I had 2 years of experience of working with prisoners, working with governors, and working with contractors and other agencies relative to offender care and management.
hmm
And you had individuals in the team who had less learning and development experience than I had. They also, some didn't have any prison experience when they joined. And yet I was on induction for 4 months, unable to make my own decisions, unable to decide which prison I was going to go and visit. I was responsible for 15 prisons, and I couldn't make a decision as to which one to visit and why to visit, who to see, what to see them about. I was prevented from making all of those decisions because I was on induction. So I was
mm,
being treated, so it was those things that were not explicitly racist. Nobody was using a racial slur, but I could see that I was being treated differently. Training that was promised all of a sudden was no longer available to me, but then was available to people who joined after me. And the excuse was, oh, well, they need it for something else. Oh, well, that something else happens to be a project that I was excluded from.
mm,
And it was that sort of thing where you start lining everything up and you
hmm
recognize you are being treated differently. And so I approached my manager, having spoken to her a couple of times about why am I on such a long induction? Is there anything else you specifically want me to know that I don't know already, given my experience? And
hmm
not getting anything substantive from her. So I thought, well, I'm just going to have to ask the question. So and so is allowed to do this. So and so has that training. So and so has access to this. I don't have access to any of those things. Why am I being treated differently? And her immediate response was, are you accusing me of racism?
Subconscious,
Right.
right there speaking.
So I was really shocked. And I thought to myself, well, why are you talking about race?
Hmm.
I've given you clear examples of what is different in terms of treatment. I mean, my actual thinking at the time was that there was some perhaps professional jealousy because
Hmm.
I took over her area, and
Right.
within the first month of actually being able to manage, I was off induction. I got really glowing reviews from the prison governors, etc. Glowing reviews about the training I had designed and delivered, and they were saying things about me that I'd never heard anyone say about Sue. So I'm
Mm,
thinking, oh, she's probably just feeling a little territorial. She had to surrender her territory to me because she was going on to do bigger and better things. She should be happy for me because she's got a promotion out of this. I'm
hmm
covering her old territory. So that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that she's still had some sort of emotional connection to the territory and was having trouble letting go. professional jealousy. So I was expecting her to do some reflecting and think, you know what, actually, yeah, you're right. Uh, I'm not sure what the issues are, but let's move forward and let's try and do it this way or that way. But no, her response was, are you accusing me of racism? And from that
Mm.
point, I thought to myself, okay, my race is at the forefront of your mind. Because if I
Hmm.
can't have a conversation with you without you raising race, that tells me something.
That is interesting. So outside of just work, you say your activities were monitored, like out of work. Like what was that about?
Yeah, so I write and perform poetry,
Hmm.
and I have a website, nairobithompson.co.uk, and I advertise the shows that I write and perform, etc. And I also do a little freelance work, um, delivering diversity and inclusion training, anti-racism, leadership development training, and I was fitting all of this in around my work.
Hmm.
And what they were doing was that they were going onto my Facebook and my Instagram, etc., checking what I was doing, and then if they found anything that they weren't sure about, I'd get called into a meeting. So it
Wow.
started when I wrote the book. To my knowledge, it could have been happening before, but when I wrote Almost British, the
Mm.
CEO at the time, she would email me and say, "Oh, you know, Waterstones say they have a copy of the book. You are not allowed to sell the book. How did Waterstones get a copy of the book?" And I'd be like, "I don't know." Do you know what I mean? So I'd get called into a meeting because somebody says they have a copy. Why aren't you asking them where they got it? I'm restricted from selling the book. I'm effectively banned from selling my book because that's what they
Wow.
effectively did in
Hmm.
2010 after I
Hmm.
wrote the first edition. And so so they were constantly monitoring where the book was being referenced. So I sat through a very long meeting with the CEO because an activist had written a blog about the lack of representation of Black people within the judiciary, which is a well-known fact. It's not news. Yeah, and he was making a comparison between, you know, if if they can treat me as an employee as badly as they have done, sufficient enough for me to go to court to win my case and write a book about it, can we trust the judiciary to be fair and objective when dealing with other Black people? And so he
Mm.
was making these, drawing these parallels. And I got called into a meeting and asked if I couldn't see the damage that was being caused, etc., or the potential for damage, and that the book that I wrote was bringing the ministry into disrepute. And my response was, well, surely the people who were found culpable as racially abusing me, they are the ones who brought the ministry into disrepute. But no, it wasn't them because they didn't intend to abuse me and their abuse wasn't malicious.
Mm.
Yeah, so because it wasn't intentional and malicious, they didn't bring the ministry into disrepute. But me writing about it, I brought the Ministry of Justice into disrepute.
See, that is really interesting to me because it makes me think about implicit bias,
Hmm.
and it's like unless you're a mind reader and you can read people's minds, how do you know what they do or how they function around you? How do you know if it's malicious or not? You know?
Exactly, exactly. And for me, what's problematic about the legal definition of harassment, for example, which is where one person treats another person differentially because of their work, that their race, and the harassment has the purpose or effect of violating someone's dignity.
Mm-hmm.
That phrase, purpose or effect, for me personally, I'm not legally trained or anything, but for me, it's problematic because it causes those assessing investigations to look for intent. They
Mm-hmm.
have to
Mm-hmm.
look for intent. For me, intent is an aggravating factor because, what you should be looking at is whether or not the act complained of happened.
And if
And
it was damaging to
yes,
the other
if there was
person,
damage
because
to the other person,
all you got to say is, "Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know that." I
yes,
say this stuff all the time. We do
right,
this all the time, and it's like,
exactly.
you know.
But
So,
the way that the legal phrasing, because it says because it has the purpose or effect of, it means that those legally assessing claims have to look for purpose, as in intention.
mm, mm,
And so what you get is you get this sort of weird dynamic where judgments are, judges are trying to work out, did somebody intend to do that? I'm like, I don't care if they intended to do it or not.
damage is done.
Damage is done, they did it. What are we going to do about it? If we look at the intention as an aggravating factor, then you consider, and they intended to do it, and then there's additional compensation because there was an intent to cause harm. But when you look at it on balance, on equal footing, intent and effect, that gives them both the same sort of weighting, gives them the same sort of weighting. And so where so we look for intent as if everybody is a member of the KKK, and if they're not a member of the KKK, then they didn't really mean it. And if they didn't really mean it, can we really say that the effect is as impactful as you say it is as the complainant?
Mm,
And you get this
that is,
conflation
hmm,
and muddying of the waters, in my view.
yeah,
So every time
absolutely.
I dealt with anything, the investigators, the court, were always looking for intent, as if that is a cornerstone of
Hmm.
an assessment. In my view, it isn't. It's an aggravating factor.
Absolutely. Speaking of the courts, what I feel like a lot of times, like when we go through these type of things in the workplace, we generally don't think about like taking this to court or seeking some legal advice or figuring out what is being done to us in a legal sense. So, what kind of made you feel comfortable or confident enough to say like this is something worthy of taking to the courts?
Yeah. So there was no confidence.
Mm.
There was no confidence at all. I felt very much backed into a corner, and that um, the way I was being treated by Sue and subsequent managers,
Hmm.
I've seen patterns of how they performance manage people out of the organization. So I know what the patterns look like. You know, they pick up on the little things. They only look for certain things, as in confirmation bias. You're late. You've been late twice. Yes, but so and so has been late 5 times, and I explained why. I let you know I was going to be late, and so on and so forth. But all that resonates is that you were late, and
Mm.
they look for reasons to, you know, pick your work to pieces, etc. So I've seen this pattern multiple times because I work in learning and development, I work in the HR space, and
Hmm.
I've seen people managed out in this way.
Right.
So when I could see these patterns, and they were the precursor to all three tribunal claims, I recognized that if I didn't do something, if I didn't stop the clock with a claim to the tribunal, I would have lost my job.
Mm. Now, some people might also be like, all right, this is really bad what's happening at work and you're experiencing, emotional, trauma and this workplace racism and everything. Like, why didn't you just
Why didn't you
leave?
just leave? Why didn't you just leave? Yeah, I wanted to desperately. But again, these wider contextual issues are what people forget. Number one, it is so hard to get a job as a Black woman of a
Mm,
certain age, looking for a certain salary,
hmm,
commensurate with their experience
hmm,
in the UK. I doubt very much it's any different in the US. So there are things that
hmm,
you have to factor in. So there were, I did pendulum swing to why should I have to leave?
hmm,
Because ultimately, if I leave a job, it should be because I'm going on to bigger and better things. It should be my decision, my choice. I want to do something different. I want to do something more complex, and so on and so forth. And it's a promotion or it's a lateral move, and it's my choice. I shouldn't have to leave my job because so and so doesn't like the color of my skin.
mm.
So there was
Good point.
that always sort of at the back of my mind. And then the other thing is the wider contextual issues. Where are you going to find a job that pays this amount? You know,
Mm.
you've got your mortgage to pay, you've got your critically ill mother to look after, and other sort
Mm.
of like, responsibilities. So I can say, right, that's it, I'm out, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Barely got any savings, like most people. You live off that for a month, 2 months, then what?
Mm.
What happens next?
Mm.
You look for a job, you go the whole interview rounds and recruitment, and you're facing the same type of discrimination, but through recruitment and selection.
You mentioned, like, every time you went to court over this 20-year span, you lost something.
Mm,
Um, so I know people might say, well, you won the case, and you got, money back from the courts and things like that. But
yeah,
there was also, an emotional toll going through this for 20 years. So can you talk about that?
yeah. So I made three applications across that sort of 17, 18-year period: 2008, 2011, and 2020 to 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So the first claim, which is the one I won, I lost my good mental health. I had never suffered with depression before. I'm, an eternal optimist to the point of naivety. I enjoy being with people, etc. I lost all of that. I was prescribed antidepressants for the first time in my life. I didn't understand what was happening in terms of the chemical imbalances in my brain. I felt worthless. None of these things, I've never really experienced these things before. And
Mm-hmm.
very, very dark days, uh, suicidal. And these were things I did not know how to deal with. I didn't know why I was experiencing them because I'm just having problems at work, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But the emotional toll was such that it deeply affected me. So I still suffer with depression. It
Mm-hmm.
never went away. So that was the first thing I lost. In 2011, my marriage failed
Mm-hmm.
while I was going through the court process. So that was another really big blow, and again taking the emotional toll. And I thought that I had not suffered as much with depression because I realized how dark things could get for me after the
Mm-hmm.
first bout. I was making an active um, commitment to not sink as far down. So my approach shifted, and I was just trying to be more proactive and get stuff done in the house because by the second court case, I'd been suspended from work. So my job
Mm-hmm.
really was under threat. But the marriage failed, and I was on my own. And then the third time, which was 2020, 2021,
Mm-hmm.
I had to give up my job.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved my job. I still love my job. I'm still doing a little freelance work here and there because I love what I do, but I had to step away. So each time I made the decision to go to court, I lost something significant in my
Mm.
life.
Man, that is it's unfortunate, and I think that a lot of us, all over the world in these workplaces go through similar things. And I'm glad you are doing a doctoral program looking into workplace racism, because I think that is something that really has to be pinpointed in terms of the terminology, and breaking down how we maneuver through it and what to do and things like that. And I think you are a great person to do that, having experienced it yourself, and then being part of that professionally.
Mm,
So before, I wanted to kind of tackle some of the common issues I think that we get into in the workplace as Black people. And what your expert opinion would be on how to deal with some of those things. Um, but before that, I kind of want to define a few things first. So, some of us, I think we struggle with understanding what is happening to us and a clear definition of what is happening to us. So, when we say you are dealing with racism at work, what exactly is that in regards to, it's not just that I'm feeling like people are being racist, but this is something that is legalized discrimination that I can bring into the court system. Like what is that in terms of just like, I'm not just feeling this, but this is happening. Like how would we define that?
Yeah, so that's a really, really great question because it is hard to work out what's happening. The law in the UK is really its foundation is on explicit forms of um, racism. So when my parents came to the UK, it was they faced signs in the windows saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
Mm,
You know, and so they were told plainly, oh, we're not going to allow you in this place because you're black, or we don't serve your kind here. So the law that came into being was to prevent that kind of overt racism. And my view is that the law hasn't really changed sufficiently enough to recognize that people rarely announce their prejudice in that way anymore.
hmm.
So it does make it very hard to know what to do. So one of the things that I always sort of like fact checked what I was experiencing, made sure everything was written down, and then I would
Mm,
reflect on it. What is upsetting me about this interaction? That's the first thing. Is it the way I was treated? Is it the words that were used? Is it that I've been denied access to something? And those questions. What should management be doing in this scenario? And I would look at what they should be doing, what levels of discretion that they have, and if anything doesn't align, that's when I realized something is not quite right here. So I sort of like went through those 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 checks to make sure that I wasn't just complaining about absolutely everything as racist. So if somebody has been quite robust in the way that they're dealing with me, did the situation call for that?
mm,
Yeah, was I behind on target? Um, it was the work that I'm doing. Did I make those mistakes, and so on and so forth? But if I find that actually no, I haven't made those mistakes, I'm not behind on target. I applied for an extension, and that extension was granted. I'm working within the new guidelines and things like that. So I was always asking questions about what happened to me, what's upsetting me about it, what should have happened, where's the evidence that this is what should have happened, and I align the two to try and help me to quantify if the treatment itself is actually differential.
got it, got it. Another word that I think is doesn't really describe what's happening, but it serves, I feel like it serves white people in the workplace, and it's called microaggressions. And I'm like, what you know this whole term of microaggressions, these small things that are done, for a lot of us, they don't feel small. They don't feel like this is just a look that somebody gave me that's a microaggression, or something they mentioned about my race, and something like that. So when I'm thinking microaggression, I'm thinking micro, not that big, not a problem, something I really shouldn't even report about and talk about. Like, how do I maneuver through that language, as somebody in a black person in the workplace, when somebody might be like, well, that's just a microaggression, you know?
So part of I share your frustrations. I understand the terminology and why the terminology is there. Um, but it is problematic because it automatically conveys a lessening. It conveys a diminishing of the situation. So partly, the organization is partly responsible for making sure that people have a full understanding of what we mean by microaggressions. So this is the sort of training that I provide. I look at the history of the terminology and what it means. We're talking about micro behaviors, micro insults, micro assaults,
Mm-hmm.
and we talk about the accumulative effect of such things
Mm-hmm.
and how they can lead to individuals working in a harassive environment. So if the organization uses microaggressions it as a way of dismissing, then that is a problem. Because what they should recognize is that it is very serious. If you're working within a culture where people are being microaggressive to others, you that culture is toxic.
Mm.
And if the organization doesn't recognize that because they are not invested in the right levels and the right types of training, they're not properly assessing the complaints, they're not quality assuring their investigation processes, etc., then you will get this sort of like, offhand, oh, well, that's just a microaggression. Okay.
Mm.
There's no such thing as just a microaggression. If people are operating within that space, that environment potentially can become very toxic.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree.
And as I said,
Um,
the days where people are blatantly announcing their prejudice and their bias, those days are not so much behind us, but they're less common.
mhm,
So,
mhm,
but people still have those prejudices, and so they
mhm.
find other ways to express them, and that's why you have to recognize that microaggressions in the workplace are a serious topic for consideration.
Yes, yes. And speaking of that, I've seen, things that occur in the news in the workplace, the most racist things that you'll ever see or hear about, and then that person, the white person that is doing these things will be like, I'm not racist. We had these implicit bias trainings and where I may have implicit biases and prejudices like
Hmm.
everybody else in the world,
Hmm.
but I'm not racist. So this whole proving that somebody's racist thing, I think, is very difficult, and this whole implicit bias thing, I think, makes it more difficult because you're saying that we all have these prejudices, and this is implicit. It's something that you don't even think about. It's subconscious.
Mm.
And I feel like it's a scapegoat for
Yeah,
uh
I
for white
agree. I agree
and
with you. It's
mhm,
implicit bias is a real thing, and
mhm.
you're absolutely right. We do all have our preferences and our biases, etc. If we both go to get a milkshake, it has to be strawberry for me. You know, don't offer me chocolate. I'm not interested, or vanilla or banana. It has to be strawberry. We all have preferences, and however those preferences are, cultivated in us over the years. That is not the issue. The brain, especially in the unconscious space, we have to categorize. It's part of how we function and make sense of the world.
Mhm.
I have to be able to look at you and know that you're wearing headphones rather than being distressed that I don't know what is on your head and whether or not that's a danger to me. Okay,
Mhm.
so my brain builds this repository of headphones, etc. So it doesn't matter what color they are, what shape they are, whether they're wireless or Bluetooth or what have you. I know what they are. They don't cause me any concern. So that's how the brain works, and that's fine. But what people do is they do use implicit bias as a get out of jail card. Well, I didn't know. That's irrelevant in my book, okay,
Mhm.
because we're looking at the impact and the effect of your actions. And there's
Mhm.
also then this conflating of ideologies around racism and being a racist. You can do racist things without being a racist.
Mm.
Okay, because anybody can make a mistake, anybody can misspeak, anybody can speak out of ignorance, etc., relative to any community that is different to them, especially where they lack understanding of that community. So
Mm.
if I say, Susan said something that was racist, that is my complaint. I am not saying Susan is a racist because I don't know if
Mhm.
she has subscribed to the ideologies of white supremacy. I don't know
Mm.
that. But what I do know is what she said or what she did was racist. But what happens is the minute you say, oh, just like Sue, are you accusing me of racism? She's basically asking me if I'm asking her if she's a racist. Yeah. So they
Mhm.
conflate everything and it muddies the waters. Because when you
Yes.
then make a complaint, you know, about Sally, you're making the complaint to Johnny, and Johnny's like, well, I know Sally. Sally's a
Mhm.
nice person. Sally's not
Mhm.
a racist. I didn't ask you if she was a racist. I said what she
Mm.
said or did was racist. Can you please look at the nature of the complaint? So you get this conflation where you make a complaint of racism and everybody's trying to work out if Sally is a racist. Again, that's an aggravating factor because
Mm-hmm.
I can't deal with her motivations. I don't know what her motivations are. I don't know what ideologies she subscribes to. What I do know is what happened to me on Thursday afternoon at 3:30.
Mm.
Can we deal with what happened to me on Thursday afternoon at 3:30? Now, if you want, after we've established those facts, if you want to then make inquiries about what motivated that action, fill your boots. Go ahead. As long as that does not detract away from what happened on Thursday afternoon at 3:30.
Mm. Great point. Great point. Great point. All right. I want to go through just a few quick scenarios that I think a lot of us experience in the workplace, and what your advice would be. Like if somebody came to you and say, Nairobi is what I'm going through. What would you say? Like, how would I deal with it? So you've dealt with this yourself, right? So I know a lot of us are in companies where we're overlooked for promotions. We're there for years. We qualify for it, and you apply, you don't get it, and then somebody comes along, maybe that's white, and they have less experience. They just gotten the job. You might have trained them. I've spoken to so many people that
I've
this
done
has
that.
happened to,
Yeah.
and they get the position that you applied for. And these things happen over and over again. So, what advice do you have for people experiencing that at the
Leave.
workplace? Leave.
Yeah, I think, I think, it's twofold because, as I said earlier, leaving isn't always an easy thing to do, and it can really undermine or compromise your financial situation, etc. But it is an option to consider. I've met people who have been pushing for promotion for a decade. I'm like, why are you still there? It's clear the organization does not want to promote you, and they jump through the hoops. Oh, you don't have this qualification, you need to get that, they get it. Oh, you don't have this lateral experience, and they go and they get that lateral experience. Take your qualification and your lateral experience with you, and hopefully go somewhere else if you can. Um, in the interim, you document what's happening to you, and you make sure that you have met the criteria, and you can challenge the selection process by asking, because most selection processes, in my view, are flawed because they have not been genuinely designed to challenge um, implicit biases. And panels are often not diverse, so you've just got that one world view on the panel, assessing what the candidate is presenting. So you can challenge the recruitment process and see if there are any flaws in there, and also look at the what I call EDI demographics, so the equality, diversity, and inclusion demographics, the data of your organization. Is the board all white? Challenge it.
Mm.
Is the senior leadership all white? Challenge it. Is the mid management, predominantly white and male? Challenge it, because those demographics, they send a cultural message throughout the organization. And so, whilst people are thinking about, oh, have I demonstrated any implicit bias in the organization when I'm recruiting, they're not also thinking about um, the in-group favoritism that they are showing. So when a candidate that matches the all-white board, the all-white team, etc., shows up for interview, they're not monitoring the fact that they recognize that as what they probably want to maintain the status quo. They're just thinking, oh, am I treating this person fairly? Or am I treating that person fairly? But there are wider contextual issues that are also informing the way you make a decision.
Indeed, indeed. Sounds very similar here, man. So let's imagine, my job wants to celebrate Black History Month, and they're like, you know what? We're gonna have a Black History party, and we're bringing in the chicken, the fried chicken. We're bringing in the watermelon. We're bringing in the mac and cheese, and just gonna celebrate Blackness. And you know, you're one of the few Black people in the workspace, and you feel very uncomfortable about attending this party. But it's part of your responsibilities. It's during the workday. How do you maneuver through that?
So I'll just get the question right. So it's your white colleagues who have decided what is stereotypically what blackness looks like. So it's the
Right.
watermelon and it's the fried chicken. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I would be offended by that, because black people are not a homogenous group. Some like fried chicken, some are vegan. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So
Yeah.
to just automatically decide from a non-black position what blackness is would be offensive to me, and I would tell them. I would tell them that, you know. And I love fried chicken, but I would still be offended because it's a very reductionist approach of my blackness and who I am. You've just decided what you think blackness is, and you go ahead. So I would speak up in that space, and they would have to ask me what I wanted to do, and I would probably go for something that is educational. And I'd want to talk about all the great black inventors and medics and architects and musicians. I would prefer to go for something educational where my colleagues leave with a better understanding of the contributions Black people have made to the world.
Great points. Great points. I know listeners might be saying, "Man, like they don't do that at work." Please
Yes,
check out
they
the
do.
news. Please check out the news
Yes, they
and
do.
see.
Yes, they do. Oh, it's
you know.
Black History Month. Let's do some chicken. Even in the UK, some of the supermarket chains, their world food sections, they'll bring out, Caribbean rice and peas or peas and rice, and it's nothing to do with our culture. I mean, it doesn't look like what we eat, but all of a sudden, and then you've got, people who don't understand our culture, don't understand the history. I mean, there was a big furore a few years ago with Jamie Oliver,
I
and
know. Yeah.
yeah. So he's a well-known chef in the UK, and he
Mm-hmm.
brought out jerk rice.
Mm.
I in the country went into meltdown over that. Now, what are you talking about? Jerk rice. Just mean because jerk isn't a seasoning. It's a process, and the
mm.
process was born out of slavery because we weren't allowed to cook in the house and what have you. We had to smoke our food outside, etc.
Mm.
So there's a history behind it. It's not something
Mm-hmm.
you can just go and appropriate and add a couple of spices to and say that's jerk rice. What have you ever smoked rice? So that
Man,
very quickly came off the shelves. Yeah, so
interesting,
it
man.
is done. People just have their idea of what blackness is. They appropriate elements of it, but it's not to celebrate our blackness. It's to
Mm-hmm.
give themselves permission to indulge in what they think we like.
Mm. Got it. Got it. Thank you for that. All right, this one. So I have coworkers who I feel personally, scenario wise, are outwardly racist. I've heard them use the N word. When I'm passing around, they make black people jokes and these stereotypical jokes, and it's a group of them. I feel uncomfortable really just addressing them personally, but any space I'm around with them, I feel like uncomfortable. I feel like they're looking at me a certain way, and I've heard them say certain things, obviously. And I feel like I'm treated by them very differently, and I feel like they're being outwardly, racist, and they even share their political views openly about people that in politics that are clearly racist that they support, and all type of things. And I'm uncomfortable in this workspace, and I don't find it funny or fun, and everybody around me treats it like it's not a big deal, but it's a big deal to me. So how do I deal with that?
Yeah, so I think again it depends on who you are as an individual, because we all function in slightly different ways. I would make a record of everything, what was said, who said it, times, places, witnesses, etc. Because especially if something is upsetting or traumatic for you, the brain has a way of recording that information in a very different way to how it records the mundane. You know. And and sometimes there are gaps in our remembering because of the pain and the hurt. So if you can't deal with it there and then, I would absolutely make a note of it, My personal preference is once that note has been made, I email so that there's an audit trail. At lunch yesterday, everybody was talking. This is what was being said. I found it uncomfortable for these reasons. I don't appreciate people behaving like that in my presence. I believe it is racist because of these reasons.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Thank.
you at least give them an opportunity to respond appropriately. They may or may not. You might get even more abuse.
Hmm.
But then you've also got an audit trail that you can take to your HR department and say, look, I have been trying to deal with this, but this is what is happening to me. This is what has been said. This is when it was said. This is who was present, etc.
Hmm.
So you've got two options because you can write it down and take it straight to HR. You don't have to tackle the group because it's not always safe to do so.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
So you have to weigh things up. Are they people just genuinely ignorant? Are they trying to antagonize? You have to weigh things up. Um, and I think a lot of people don't like to rock the boat. And when I'm working with people, I tell them everything will cost you something.
Hmm.
So the choice is yours. Inaction will cost you because that inaction means that you will consistently be exposed to the thing that is causing you harm. And taking action will cost you because it might
Hmm.
cost you their friendship, it might cost you whatever respect they had for you. It might cost you your job. Everything
Absolutely.
costs you something. You have to decide what price you're prepared to pay.
Hmm. Great point. Great point. Thank you for that one. So let's imagine that the UK government is like, Nairobi, we love the work that you're doing, and we
Well,
we
listen, I'm just looking for that flying pig. Hold on.
imagine now.
That flying pig out my window.
and
Come back, Nairobi. We serve you. Mm.
and they are like, you know what, we want to fix these things, deal, these, the workplace racism, the discrimination that black people and people of color are dealing with in our workspaces, and we don't want this to be an issue anymore. We know you have a great deal of training and information and experience about this. um, we'll give you an unlimited budget. How do we
Woo.
go about
Keep
how do
talking.
we how do we go about fixing these things and making black and brown people comfortable in the workspace and giving them what they deserve?
Mm.
How do we make this a just environment?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I say, pigs might fly, but one has to remain hopeful. One has to remain hopeful. That's very encouraging. If the Ministry of Justice or any organisation is willing to have that conversation, because that in itself shows a level of commitment um, to move forward. Fundamentally, the things, and these are the things I'm looking at now whilst I'm doing my research, is I would look at what is currently in place. Do you have an equality statement, an anti-racism statement? Is it just something on a website, or are you actively living the values that underpin those statements? Where is the evidence of that? So it's not about just putting initiatives in place. I think a lot of organizations, especially after the murder of George Floyd, there was also like, oh, we're going to do reverse mentoring. Let's do some focus groups. Let's do some coaching. And it's all of this sort of, spontaneous activity that doesn't change anything. You have to look at your organization. Is it, do you have a racial hierarchical structure in your organization? Is all the power sitting with white people? You have to deal with that. There's no point in coming to me and saying, oh, Nairobi, can you come and do some training, when the entire board is white, the entire senior leadership is white, and so on and so forth. Who am I training, and what am I training you to do? So you have to develop an anti-racism stance, and you have to understand what that means. You also then have to be willing to recognize what workplace racism looks like, how it presents. In that, as I said earlier, when we started this discussion, it's not always going to be blatant name calling and pejorative terms and blatant or explicit stereotyping. whilst those things still happen, you have to recognize that that is not the only indicator of racism in the workplace. And you have to look at your EDI demographics. Who's being promoted? Who's been given those special projects? Who's been given the latitude and the flexibility? And who is not getting access to the same latitude and the same levels of flexibilities? You have to be prepared to look at all of those things before we even take one foot down the training route. Yeah, because people can be trained, but then the infrastructure doesn't support the training. They have no policies that recognize what microaggressions are, for example. So I can do a whole training around microaggressions, and then there's no policy that supports what I say microaggressions are.
Mm.
So how do you then, after I've gone, complain about microaggressions when none of the senior team who are going to manage the complaint understand what microaggressions are? And they don't understand the culture of their own organization. They don't understand the attitudes of their own leadership team with regards to race, because they've got people within their leadership teams who think that if you focus on race, it is to the detriment of other equality strands. Or if you focus on race, you're making black people feel bad, or you're making white people feel bad. And these people are in the leadership teams. Do you know who they are? Do you know that they think that? So there's a lot to look at. It can't just be, oh, let's get Nairobi in to do some training, and how else can we make it safe for people? They need to have a really good, hard look at the fact that they are probably structured in line with a race-based system of advantage for white people.
Well said. Well said. Well said. Man, Nairobi's been a pleasure talking to you today, man. I feel like I've affirmed so much and learned so much at the same time. So you've been doing this work for quite a while. And you got your book and everything, and now you're doing your doctoral program on workplace racism. So, just looking at you as an individual, what is the legacy that you want to leave behind with the work that you're doing, and what do we want people to know and understand about Nairobi Thompson and what she was doing when it's all said and done?
The reason I believe I'm on this journey is to help others navigate this minefield of racism within the workplace, and to start sort of the conflations that I talked about earlier on, where people conflate ideology with behavior, and so on and so forth. The things that make it very difficult for us to say, look, this was a racist act, this was a racist comment, or it had racial overtones that affected me negatively. I want to unpack all of that as best as I can to my ability, so that the person on the receiving end has a common language to be able to articulate their experience. And the person assessing the complaint also has the same common language. And they are appreciative of the factors that will impede their objectivity. And that's what I want to leave. I want to untangle this whole ball of spaghetti, or string, and get some clarity, so that as a victim and survivor and thriver, I know what I mean when I say this is what I experienced, and you know what I mean when I say that I've experienced something.
Hmm. Yes, yes, yes. After this doctoral program, we're going to need a book on workplace racism by Nairobi Thompson, so we can get the language correct. We can make sure we're on point, because I think everything you spoken about today was on point, on the money, and you gave us some great information that I think we all need when it comes to maneuvering through these workspaces. Because I feel like as Black people all over the world, as we ascend up higher, it gets less and less of us and more, white generally. And a lot of us struggle with how to maneuver through those spaces. Some of us are dealing with those spaces for the first time.
Hmm.
And some of us are not really comfortable having a voice in those spaces. So I feel like experiences like yours and having that language and understanding of what is happening here. And a lot of things that you mentioned is very, very helpful. So appreciate that. And we generally ask our guests, to leave us with their favorite quote and what it means to them. But I know you are a poet. So if you could use some of your talents to leave us with some poetry for today, that would be amazing.
Okay, I'd be happy to. This piece is called Defiant.
Mm.
They looked at me as though I had gone mad, as if by some cognitive fluke I had failed to appreciate I'd been bettered and beaten, was unaware that I had been eaten and by now should be disaffected by their superior intellect, how I had remained unaffected by the many times they had stolen my contributions. How was I still embracing the power of my own blackness, having rejected their view of me? With a slight incline of my head, I smiled and said, "Don't you know who I am?" Straightening my head and with steady gaze, I said, "I am an African queen, stolen and traded 20 million times over. Attempts at systematically erasing my memory have failed. Trying to breed the black out of me has failed. Refusing to educate me has failed. Even the glass ceiling cannot keep this black woman back as my spirit simply passes through it. I am not beautiful because you have decided which shade of my skin is in. I am beautiful because I choose to believe I am. It's how I was made. You can't take that away from me. Go back to your history books and see that your best efforts at annihilation have never truly diminished me, resistant and rising, persistent and climbing ever upwards. And there's not one thing you can do about it. So, how you like me now?"
Yes. Beautiful, 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 beautiful. Man, Nairobi, has been a pleasure having you on the program. I think you will be revisiting guests. We'll definitely have you back on
It
because
will be my pleasure.
we need more poetry and we need more information. Yeah. So where can listeners find you that want to look into your work, your poetry, and the work that you're doing with workplace racism?
Yes, so everything is Nairobi Thompson. So the website is www.nairobithompson.co.uk. Instagram the same, Nairobi Thompson. LinkedIn the same. I'm old. I keep it simple.
There it is. There it is. Definitely check out Nairobi's work. Check out her website, her book, looking into workplace racism, and then her new book. We're waiting on that. So keep everybody posted. But we will definitely have Nairobi back on the program, and hopefully this interview today was helpful for people experiencing workplace racism and going through some of these things. And it could be difficult, but when you have the information and the right terminology and the words, and you know what to do, document it, write it down, send emails, make sure you are doing things that will be able to be used in court, like Nairobi has done. So definitely do those things. And of course, remember, your mind is the most powerful tool in the universe. If you can think it, you can do it. If you believe in it, you can be it. And if you fight for it, you can have it. The world is yours. This has been your host, Mr. G, and I will see you next time on MasterMine.
So every day I'm going hard. I'm talking business, bank accounts, and credit cards. And somehow we defeat the odds and making sure that no one starve illegal. All you had